The hidden key was inside the watch. Eleanor had almost thrown the watch away. She'd packed it into a box marked Donate, sealed the box, carried it to the front door, and then stood there for a reason she couldn't explain, even to herself. Something made her open it again. Something made her reach inside and feel along the lining. The key was small, brass, worn smooth from decades of being held. She knew immediately what it opened. The one door in 38 years of marriage she had never been allowed to touch. Her husband, Arthur, had only ever said 3 words about that room. Not for you. He had been a quiet man, a careful man, a man who kept things separate in ways Eleanor had learned not to question. She had trusted him. Standing on the harbor front that gray Tuesday morning, suitcase at her feet, 30 days to vacate the only home she'd known since 1986, she realized she had 1 hour before her stepchildren arrived to change the locks. 1 hour, 1 key, 1 door that had been waiting 38 years to be opened. What Eleanor Marsh found inside that workshop did not just change her life. It answered every question she had been afraid to ask. Eleanor Marsh had lived on Dunmore Harbor for 38 years, and she still hadn't gotten used to the smell of it. Salt and diesel and something older underneath. The particular cold of the North Sea pushing in before dawn, settling into the stone walls of the cottages like it owned them. Which, in some ways, it did. She'd grown up inland, a schoolteacher from Shropshire who'd come to the Northumberland coast for a weekend in the spring of 1985 and never quite left. That was Arthur's fault. He'd been standing outside his workshop when she first saw him, a lean, weathered man in his early 40s, sanding the hull of an old fishing boat with the focused quiet of someone who didn't notice he was being watched. She'd been walking the harbor wall with a friend. She'd looked over. He'd looked up. He hadn't smiled. He'd simply looked at her for a long moment, then looked back at the boat. Her friend had laughed and pulled her along. Eleanor had looked back twice. 6 months later, she moved to Dunmore. 8 months after that, they were married in the small church on the hill above the harbor, 12 people in attendance, a reception that lasted exactly 2 hours because Arthur had work to finish in the morning. It was not a romantic beginning by any conventional measure, but Eleanor had never been interested in convention. She took a job at the local primary school teaching year 4s. She planted a garden in the small yard behind the cottage. She learned the names of the fishing boats and their owners, learned which neighbors left their doors unlocked, and which ones preferred not to be greeted before 9 in the morning. She built a life inside the life Arthur already had, fitting herself into its edges carefully, without forcing anything. Arthur noticed. She could tell by the way he watched her sometimes from across a room, not warmly exactly, but with attention, as if she was a problem he found interesting rather than troubling. He was not a man who used words for things he considered important. That was something Eleanor understood early and accepted without bitterness. Some people kept their depth private. It didn't mean the depth wasn't there. The workshop was at the far end of the harbor wall, a small stone building separate from everything else, with a single salt-hazed window and a heavy door that Arthur kept locked with the kind of padlock that suggested he meant it. He went there most evenings after dinner, sometimes on weekend mornings before Eleanor was awake. He always came back smelling of oil and something she couldn't identify, something chemical and faintly sweet that she associated entirely with him and never investigated. She asked once, "Early in the marriage, the way you ask things when you're still learning the shape of someone. What are you doing there?" He had looked at her over his tea. "Work," he said. "On what?" 3 seconds of silence, the particular silence Arthur used when he was deciding something. "Not for you," he said. Then he picked up his tea and walked to the window, and the conversation was finished. She could have pushed. She knows that now. She was not a woman who lacked the capacity for pushing. 30 years of managing classrooms full of 8-year-olds had given her considerable capability in that regard. But she looked at his back as he stood at the window, at the particular set of his shoulders, and she made a decision she would make 10,000 more times across 38 years of marriage. She trusted him. Not blindly, not without questions that arose and were set aside, but fundamentally, in the way that matters. She believed Arthur Marsh was a man whose locked doors did not hide anything worth fearing. She believed she knew the essential truth of him even without knowing every detail. She built her life around that belief. Arthur's children made their position clear at the wedding and never revised it. Philip was 43 now, but Eleanor remembered him at 19, arms folded throughout the ceremony, jaw tight, the expression of a young man performing stoicism because anger would have been too honest. He shook Eleanor's hand at the reception. Once. Briefly. With the energy of someone completing an administrative task. Caroline had been warmer in a way that was somehow worse. She smiled throughout the reception and asked Eleanor thoughtful questions about her life in Shropshire, and never once came to Dunmore after that day, unless Arthur specifically requested it. They called him every Sunday, brief calls, practical, about money or arrangements or the logistics of the occasional Christmas visit. Eleanor would hear Arthur's side from the kitchen. Yes. No, that's fine. I'll think about it. He never once said, Eleanor and I. She noticed. She filed it away in the place she kept things she had decided not to examine too closely, and she got on with her day. 38 years passed the way long marriages do. Not quickly, not slowly, but in layers. Seasons inside seasons. The year the roof needed replacing. The year Eleanor's mother died and Arthur sat beside her at the funeral without touching her and without moving for 2 hours, which was its own kind of holding. The year Philip got divorced and called Arthur every night for 3 weeks, and Arthur took the calls in his study with the door closed. The year Eleanor retired from teaching and discovered that a quiet house with a quiet man was either peaceful or lonely, depending on the quality of the light. She had mostly decided it was peaceful. Arthur died on a Wednesday morning in November. Eleanor had brought him tea at 7:30, the way she had every morning for 38 years. He was sitting in his chair by the bedroom window, facing the harbor. His eyes were open. His tea went cold on the sill. The doctor said it had been quick. Eleanor sat with him for 20 minutes before she called anyone. She used the time to memorize his face. She had a feeling, even then, that she was going to need it. Philip called the morning after the funeral, not to ask how she was, not to talk about his father. He called to confirm the name of the solicitor handling the estate and to ask whether Eleanor knew where Arthur kept his financial records. She told him. She wrote down the solicitor's number. She passed on everything he asked for without hesitation, because that is what Eleanor Marsh did. She helped, she organized, she made things easier for everyone around her, and she did not think to wonder whether she should. The reading of the will was scheduled for a Thursday. 10 in the morning at the office of a solicitor named Gerald Holt, in a gray stone building on Dunmore's High Street that Eleanor had walked past 10,000 times without ever going inside. She dressed carefully. Dark navy, not black. She'd always thought full black at legal meetings looked like you were performing grief rather than feeling it. She put on the earrings Arthur had given her for their 20th anniversary. Small pearls. She had never particularly liked them, but she wore them because it felt important to carry something of his into that room. Philip and Caroline were already there when she arrived. They had brought a woman Eleanor didn't recognize, late 30s, sharp suit, a leather folder open across her knees. Philip introduced her as Rachel without a surname, without explaining her role. Eleanor shook her hand and sat down across the table and understood immediately that Rachel was a solicitor of their own. They had brought their own solicitor to a will reading for a man who had died 4 days ago. Eleanor set her hands flat on the table and said nothing. Gerald Holt was a quiet man in his 60s who had the particular manner of someone who had delivered unwelcome news so many times it had ceased to be uncomfortable and become simply procedural. He offered tea. Nobody wanted tea. He opened his folder. The estate, he said, consisted of the Harbor Cottage, number 14, Dunmore Harbor Front, valued at approximately £420,000, Arthur's savings account, which held just under $60,000, his tools and materials, valued nominally, his van, his personal effects, and the workshop. Number 3, Harbor Wall, valued separately. Gerald Holt read from the document in front of him. The cottage and all savings were to be divided equally between Philip Arthur Marsh and Caroline Mary Marsh. Eleanor felt the room tilt slightly. Not dramatically, just the small internal shift of a person whose footing has become uncertain without any visible reason. The tools, the van, the personal effects, also to Philip and Caroline. She waited. Gerald Holt looked up briefly, then back down. The workshop at number 3, Harbor Wall, its structure, its contents, and the land on which it stood, was to pass in its entirety to Eleanor Jean Marsh, exclusive of all other claims. Irrevocable. Eleanor looked at the table. The workshop. The locked workshop at the end of the harbor wall that she had spent 38 years not being permitted to enter. Arthur had left her that, and he had left her nothing else. Philip spoke first. He had the voice of a man who had rehearsed what he was about to say, probably the night before, probably more than once. Obviously, we want this to be as straightforward as possible for everyone. He glanced at Eleanor. The cottage will need to go on the market fairly quickly. We've already had an initial conversation with an estate agent, just a preliminary chat, nothing formal. But the market in Dunmore is strong right now, and it makes sense to move while conditions are good. Eleanor looked at him. We'd want you out within 4 weeks if possible, Caroline said. Her voice was not unkind, which was somehow the worst thing about it. We know that's not a huge amount of time, but we thought it was better to be clear up front rather than let things drag. You'll have the workshop, of course, and we'll make sure the transition is as smooth as we can make it. As smooth as we can make it. Eleanor thought about the garden she had planted in 1987, the roses along the back wall that had taken 6 years to establish, the kitchen she had redesigned herself, tile by tile, over the course of a rainy February, the bedroom window that looked out over the harbor at a particular angle that meant, on clear mornings, you could see all the way to the headland. She thought about 38 years. Then she thought, they planned this before the funeral, not after. Before. The estate agent conversation, the 4-week timeline, the solicitor sitting across the table with her leather folder and her careful neutrality. They had planned this while Arthur's body was still in the ground. 4 weeks is fine, Eleanor said. Philip looked mildly surprised. He had perhaps expected more resistance. We really do want to make this easy, Caroline said again, filling the silence. I heard you the first time, Eleanor said. Not aggressively, simply. Gerald Holt looked at his papers. Rachel, the solicitor, wrote something in her folder. Philip cleared his throat. Eleanor stood, picked up her coat, and walked to the door. One question, she said without turning around. The workshop. Did either of you ever go inside it? Silence. No, Philip said finally. He never let us in either. Eleanor nodded once. She walked out into the gray Dunmore morning, down the high street, past the post office and the chandlery and the small cafe where she and Arthur had eaten breakfast every Saturday for 30 years. She walked to the harbor wall. She stood and looked at the workshop at the far end. Small. Stone. The salt-hazed window catching what little light the November sky was offering. She did not have the key. She didn't know where the key was. She stood there for a long time anyway. Then she turned and walked back to the cottage that had 4 weeks left of being hers, and began, slowly, to pack up 38 years of a life she had believed was permanent. Arthur's watch was in the bedside drawer. She almost didn't open it. The packing took longer than it should have. Not because Eleanor had too much. She had, in the way of people who have lived quietly and practically for decades, less than you would expect. 2 wardrobes of clothes. A shelf of books she actually read rather than displayed. Kitchen things she had chosen herself, and kitchen things that had simply accumulated, the way objects do in long marriages, arriving without ceremony and staying without reason. It took longer because every room contained a question she hadn't thought to ask while Arthur was alive. She found it in the small things, not the large ones. In the kitchen, clearing the shelf above the cooker, she found a small glass jar of dried lavender that she hadn't put there. She had no memory of it arriving. She turned it over in her hands for a long moment. Arthur had not been a man who bought dried lavender. He had not been a man who bought anything decorative, anything soft, anything whose sole purpose was to make a room smell pleasant. She set it carefully in the box she was keeping rather than the box she was leaving. In the bedroom, folding the last of his shirts before sending them to the charity shop, she found a photograph tucked into the breast pocket of his good jacket. The jacket he wore to funerals and the occasional dinner in town. The pocket she had never had reason to check. It was a photograph of Eleanor. Not a formal one, not a holiday photograph or a birthday. It was a photograph taken in the back garden on what looked like an ordinary summer afternoon. Eleanor was kneeling in the soil next to the rose bed, not looking at the camera, not performing anything. Her hair was loose, there was a smear of dirt on her forearm. She was looking at something in her hands, a cutting maybe, or a root she was examining, with an expression of total, unguarded concentration. She had no memory of Arthur taking it. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at it for a long time. There was something disorienting about seeing yourself through someone else's eyes, particularly when the someone was gone and couldn't explain the moment, couldn't tell you why they had taken it, what they had been thinking, why they had kept it in the pocket closest to their chest for what might have been years. She put the photograph in her coat pocket. Then she went back to packing. The workshop sat at the edge of her attention throughout those 4 weeks the way a word you can't quite remember sits at the edge of your tongue. Present, insistent, unresolvable. She walked past it every day. It was impossible not to. The harbor wall was the most direct route between the cottage and the high street, and Eleanor had never been the kind of person who took indirect routes simply to avoid something uncomfortable. She walked past it and looked at it and kept walking. The locked door had always been there, of course. She cast her mind back to the first year of the marriage, trying to remember exactly when she had stopped actively wondering about it. It must have been a gradual thing. The wondering had been present early. She remembered standing at the bedroom window one evening in that first winter, watching Arthur's silhouette move behind the workshop's salt-hazed glass, and feeling a small, sharp curiosity that was not quite jealousy and not quite suspicion, but something adjacent to both. She had mentioned it once to her friend Diane, who had laughed. Men always need a shed, Diane had said. Something that's entirely theirs with no women in it. It's nothing. It means nothing. Eleanor had accepted this because it was convenient, and because she had been happy enough in those early years that doubt felt like ingratitude. As the years accumulated, other things had demanded her attention, the rhythms of work and seasons, and the particular small negotiations of a shared life. Arthur's silences, which she had mapped carefully over decades and learned to read as reliably as weather. This silence means he is tired. This one means he is content. This one means something is wrong that he will not discuss for 3 days, and then mention once and never again. She had become fluent in him, or she had believed she had. There was a memory she returned to more than once during those 4 weeks of packing. About 15 years into the marriage, she had come home from school earlier than expected. A half day, some staff meeting canceled at the last minute. She had walked down the harbor wall the way she always did, and as she passed the workshop, she had heard something that stopped her completely. Music. Not from a radio. Something older than that. Something that sounded like it was coming from somewhere deep inside the building. A melody she didn't recognize, slow and particular. The kind of sound a place makes when it doesn't know anyone is listening. She had stood very still. Then she had walked on. She had never mentioned it to Arthur. She wasn't sure, even now, why she hadn't. Perhaps because asking would have broken something she preferred to leave intact. Perhaps because some part of her had understood, even then, that the workshop was Arthur's interior life made physical. A space where he existed in a way he couldn't exist anywhere else. And that asking him to explain it would be like asking him to explain himself, which was a thing he had never been capable of and which she had long since stopped expecting. She had loved him anyway. That was the uncomplicated truth at the center of all the complicated questions. She had loved him, and she had trusted him, and she had built a life inside his silences rather than fighting them, and for 38 years that had been enough. On the last night in the cottage, Eleanor sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea she didn't drink and looked at the garden through the window. The roses along the back wall were bare in the November cold, just brown canes and thorns, the same as they had been every November for 35 years. In spring they would flower again. Whoever lived here after her would see them flower and would not know that the woman who planted them was the same woman who had carefully cut them back every October and fed them every March, and spent one entire weekend in the summer of 2004 fighting off an aphid infestation with the focused intensity of someone whose rose bed was not a garden feature but a commitment. She left them anyway. She left most things. What she took. Her clothes, her books, her mother's dishes, the photograph from Arthur's jacket pocket, the small jar of lavender from the kitchen shelf, and the watch. The watch she had found in the bedside drawer on the 3rd day of packing. A plain thing, steel and leather, the kind Arthur had worn every day until his wrists had grown too thin for it in the last 2 years of his life. She had held it in her palm, feeling its weight, and had been about to set it in the box for the charity shop when something stopped her. Something she could not name. She had turned it over. On the back, engraved in Arthur's own handwriting, she recognized it immediately. The particular way he made his capital letters were 2 words. For Eleanor. She had opened the back of the watch without knowing why. The key was so small she almost missed it, pressed flat against the inner casing, held there by a thin strip of tape that had yellowed with age. Brass. Worn smooth. She knew immediately what had opened. She had sat down on the bedroom floor with her back against the bed and held it in both hands and stayed there for a long time. Not because she was afraid, because she understood suddenly and completely that whatever was behind that door was not a secret Arthur had been keeping from her. It was a secret he had been keeping for her, and he had spent 38 years waiting for exactly the right moment to give it. On the morning of the 28th day, Eleanor Marsh carried the last box to her car, locked the cottage door for the final time, and posted the key through the letterbox the way Philip had asked her to. She stood on the harbor front for a moment. The sea was flat and gray and cold. A few gulls moved against the sky. A fishing boat she had known for 20 years was coming in from the east, riding low and slow the way they do when the hold is full. Ordinary morning. The last ordinary morning of the life she had known. She turned and walked toward the far end of the harbor wall. Philip had said he would arrive at 10 to deal with the estate agent. It was 8:30. She had 90 minutes. The workshop door was exactly as it had always been. The same heavy wood, the same iron lock, the same salt-hazed window that had never once let her see inside. Eleanor stood in front of it. She had imagined this moment during 38 years of walking past. She had imagined it during 4 weeks of packing. She had imagined it differently each time, sometimes with trepidation, sometimes with anger at herself for never having pushed harder, sometimes with a kind of grief she couldn't quite locate the source of. Standing here now, key in hand, she felt none of those things. She felt, of all things, calm. The key turned on the first try. The first thing she noticed was the smell. Not oil, not the cold salt air of the harbor that had worked its way into every building on the waterfront over the past 150 years. Something else. Something that took her a moment to place because it was the last thing she had expected to find in a boat restorer's workshop on a November morning on the Northumberland coast. Paint. Not the industrial kind, not the marine varnish and anti-foul she had always assumed was the chemical sweetness she had smelled on Arthur's clothes. This was linseed oil and pigment. The particular layered smell of oil paint that has been used for years in an enclosed space, that has soaked into the walls and the timber and the air itself until the room is inseparable from the work that was done inside it. Eleanor stood in the doorway. The workshop was dark. The single window on the harbor side let in a pale gray light that reached perhaps 6 feet before giving up. She could see the floor immediately in front of her. Stone flags, clean, worn smooth, and the edge of a wooden workbench along the right-hand wall, and beyond that, nothing but shapes she couldn't read. She found the light switch on the inside wall where she would have put it herself. The bulb that came on was warm. A single pendant hanging low from the center of the ceiling, the kind of light that makes everything beneath it feel significant. Eleanor looked up. Then she looked left. Then she looked right. Then she took one step back and put her hand against the doorframe because her legs had decided, without consulting her, that they needed the support. The walls were covered, floor to ceiling on every side. Canvases of every size, some framed, some not, some stacked 2 and 3 deep against the lower walls where the hanging space had run out. Large ones, small ones, some no bigger than a sheet of writing paper, some that took up 3 feet of wall on their own. Dozens of them, scores of them. Eleanor's eyes moved across them slowly, the way your eyes move across something that your brain has not yet decided how to process. She thought at first that they were seascapes. The colors were right for it, grays and greens and the particular deep blue of the North Sea on a clear day. And the shapes had that quality of movement she associated with water and sky. Her eyes made sense of it that way, for perhaps 3 seconds. Then she saw the hands. In the large canvas directly opposite the door, almost the first thing you would see on entering. Hands in soil. Garden soil, dark and damp, fingers pressed deep into it, a woman kneeling. The angle was from above and slightly behind, the figure caught in the act of planting something, a cutting or a root, entirely absorbed. Eleanor recognized the rose bed before she recognized herself. The rose bed as it had looked in the early years of the marriage, before the plants had grown into themselves, when the soil between them was still more visible than the canes. She knew the exact angle of light in that painting. It was the light of a June afternoon falling from the west across the back garden, catching the loose hair of the woman kneeling in the soil. Her hair, before it went gray. She moved to the next one without making a decision to move. A kitchen. Her kitchen, the old configuration before she had changed it in 2003, the dresser against the wall that she had eventually replaced, the particular yellow of the morning light through the east-facing window. A woman sitting at the table reading, one hand wrapped around a mug, the other turning a page. The face in profile, not performing anything, not aware of being seen. And the next. The harbor front in winter, a gray afternoon, a woman walking into a headwind with her coat pulled close. Head down. The posture of someone who has walked this stretch of waterfront 1,000 times and is walking it again out of habit rather than intention. You could not see her face, you did not need to. The way she carried herself was portrait enough. And the next, and the next, and the next. Eleanor at the school gate, years ago, talking to another teacher. Eleanor asleep in the armchair by the sitting room window on what must have been a Sunday, a book open across her chest, the light behind her going gold. Eleanor standing at the bedroom window with her back to the room, looking out at the harbor, her posture carrying something that might have been contemplation or might have been loneliness, and Arthur had seen both possibilities and painted the uncertainty rather than resolving it. 38 years of her life. Witnessed, remembered, kept. She was crying before she understood she had started. Not the heaving kind of crying that announces itself and demands acknowledgement. The quiet kind that simply arrives and runs without asking permission. The kind that belongs to moments that are too large for any more manageable response. She sat down on the floor. The stone flags were cold through her coat. She didn't notice. She sat in the center of 38 years of Arthur's attention and looked at the woman he had spent a lifetime painting and tried to reconcile her with the woman she believed she had been, the woman who had suspected in her harder moments that she had been peripheral to her own marriage, tolerated rather than chosen, convenient rather than beloved. The woman on these walls was not peripheral. She was the entire subject, every canvas, every study, every small painting no bigger than a hand that showed nothing but a detail. The way Eleanor held a pen, the specific angle at which she tilted her head when she was listening to something carefully, the back of her neck in summer when she pinned her hair up against the heat. Arthur had looked at her. He had looked at her with the kind of attention that most people reserve for things they are afraid of losing. And he had never once found the words to tell her. She stayed on the floor for a long time. When she finally stood, her knees aching and her face cold and stiff, she began to move through the workshop properly. Not looking at the paintings now, but looking at the space itself. At how it was organized, at what it told her about the man who had worked here. The workbench along the right wall held his materials. Brushes in glass jars, sorted by size. Tubes of paint organized by color in shallow wooden trays he had made himself, she could tell by the joinery. A palette, clean. He had cleaned it last, she realized, on the final visit he had made here before his health made the walk to the harbor wall impossible. He had cleaned his palette on his last day here. He had left the workshop tidy. He had known he wasn't coming back. She pressed her hand flat against the workbench and held it there. Against the far wall, behind the largest of the stacked canvases, she found a wooden cabinet with 2 drawers. The top drawer held what she expected: receipts for materials, a few reference photographs, the practical administration of a working artist. The second drawer held something she had not expected at all: a single envelope, cream-colored, sealed. Her name written on the front in Arthur's hand, not his everyday handwriting, the quick functional script of shopping lists and phone messages, but the careful version he used when something mattered, the version she had seen on their wedding card. On the card he left with the roses every anniversary. On the back, in smaller letters. Open this last. She set it on the workbench. She went back to the paintings. The oldest ones were at the back of the room, the ones stacked against the wall because there was no longer space to hang them. She worked through them carefully, turning each canvas to the light. They were dated on the back in pencil. Arthur's habit, she would learn, was to date every piece on the reverse, month and year, never signing the front. The earliest was from 1986, 1 year into the marriage. It was small, perhaps 8 inches by 10. Eleanor sitting on the harbor wall, late summer by the light, her legs dangling over the edge, looking out to sea. She would have been 29. She looked younger than that somehow. Or perhaps she just looked like someone who had not yet learned all the things that would later settle into her face. She turned it over. On the back, below the date, Arthur had written something. 3 words, in the same careful hand as the envelope. She is everything. Eleanor set the painting down very gently, the way you set down something you are afraid of dropping. She stood in the middle of the workshop, between the light and the paintings and the clean palette and the sealed envelope waiting on the workbench. Outside, the harbor was going about its morning. She could hear the water, the occasional cry of a gull, the low engine of a boat somewhere to the east. Ordinary sounds. The world continuing as though nothing had shifted. As though a woman had not just walked into a stone room on a harbor wall and found 38 years of proof that she had been loved in a way she had never allowed herself to fully believe. She looked at the envelope. Open this last. She turned back to the paintings. She was going to do exactly what he asked. She had time. For the first time in 4 weeks, she had nothing but time. Philip could wait. She opened the envelope at 9:30. She had spent the previous hour moving through the paintings slowly, the way you walk through a place you know you are going to have to leave and want to memorize before you do. She looked at every canvas, every small study, every painting on the stacked piles against the wall, turning each one to the light, reading the dates on the back. 1986, 89, 93, 2001, 2011. 38 years without a single gap. He had never stopped. She sat on the workbench stool with the envelope in her lap. Outside, she could hear the harbor beginning to fill with the sounds of mid-morning, the delivery van that came to the chandlery on Thursdays, the particular creak of the mooring lines when the tide was turning. Ordinary sounds that had been the background of her life for nearly 4 decades. She opened the envelope. There were 2 things inside. The first was a document, several pages folded together, the letterhead of a firm of solicitors in Newcastle that she didn't recognize. She unfolded it carefully. It was a deed of trust. Dated the 14th of March, 1987, 1 year and 3 months into the marriage. The language was the dense formal English of legal documents, but Eleanor had taught for 30 years and was not easily defeated by complicated text. She read it through twice, slowly, making sure she understood. The workshop at number 3, Harbor Wall, Dunmore, its structure, its land, and all contents created within it, had been placed in an irrevocable trust in Eleanor's name in March of 1987, not left to her in the will, transferred to her directly, legally, and completely more than 3 decades ago. It had been hers for 36 years without her knowing it. Furthermore, and this was the part that made her read the sentence 3 times to be certain she had understood it correctly, the trust included a clause that valued the contents of the workshop at the time of transfer as a separate legal asset, independent of the estate, unreachable by any other claim or inheritance arrangement, now or in the future. Philip and Caroline could not touch it. They never could have. Arthur had made sure of that in 1987, when the marriage was still new and his children's resentment was already established, and he had understood, with the quiet clarity of a man who spent his life observing things carefully, exactly how this would one day unfold. Eleanor set the legal document on the workbench. She picked up the second thing from the envelope, a single sheet of paper, unfolded. Arthur's handwriting, the careful version, dated 3 years ago. She read it, then she read it again. Then she folded it once, held it against her chest with both hands, and closed her eyes. She stayed like that for a long time. Philip arrived at 7 minutes past 10. Eleanor heard his car on the harbor front before she heard him try the cottage door and find it locked, the key already through the letterbox as he had asked. She heard him ring the bell twice, then silence, then footsteps on the cobblestones moving toward the harbor wall. She was standing in the doorway of the workshop when he reached her. He stopped. He looked at the open door, the door that had been locked for 38 years, and then at Eleanor, and something moved across his face that she couldn't immediately name. It was not guilt, exactly. It was the expression of a man who has walked confidently into a room and discovered the furniture has been rearranged in the dark. "You found the key," he said. "It was in the watch," Eleanor said. He looked past her into the workshop. From where he stood, he would be able to see the edge of the nearest canvases, the warm light of the pendant bulb, the suggestion of the paintings that covered every wall. "What's in there?" he asked. "Your father's life's work," Eleanor said. Philip's eyes came back to her. "Can I—" "No," Eleanor said. Not unkindly, simply. He blinked. "Eleanor, this workshop was transferred to me in 1987, she said, in an irrevocable trust that your father established specifically so that it could never be part of the estate. It has been mine for 36 years. Everything inside it is mine. You'll want to have your own solicitor confirm that, and I encourage you to do so, because I'm going to be making some decisions in the coming weeks, and I'd rather you heard the legal position clearly before that happens than found yourself surprised by it afterward." Silence. The tide was coming in. She could hear it against the harbor wall below them, the slow, patient push of water that had been doing the same thing against the same stones for longer than any building in Dunmore had been standing. "What decisions?" Philip said carefully. "I'm going to have the paintings assessed," Eleanor said. "I've already placed a call to an art dealer in Newcastle this morning. I don't know what they're worth. I don't particularly care what they're worth. But I intend to find out, and I intend to make sure the right people see them." "What right people?" "People who will understand what they are," Eleanor said. "Your father was a painter for 38 years and nobody knew it. That seems to me like something that deserves to be corrected." Philip stood on the harbor wall in the November morning and looked at his father's workshop and at the woman his father had married and at everything he had assumed and planned and arranged, and Eleanor watched him understand slowly and without assistance that he had miscalculated in a way that could not be undone. He had taken the cottage. He had taken the savings and the tools and the van. He had given Eleanor the one thing his father had always intended for her to have, and it turned out to be the only thing that mattered. "I need to call Caroline," he said finally. "That's fine," Eleanor said. He turned and walked back up the harbor wall toward his car. Eleanor watched him go. Then she turned back to the workshop, to the warm light and the smell of old paint and the walls covered in 38 years of a love that had been too deep and too private for words. She pulled the door almost closed behind her. Not locked. She was done with locked doors. The art dealer from Newcastle arrived 4 days later. Her name was Miriam Osei. She was in her 50s, sharp-eyed and unhurried, the kind of person who had been doing her job long enough to have stopped being surprised by anything, and had found that this made her better at it rather than jaded. She walked into the workshop, looked at the walls for a long time without speaking, and then turned to Eleanor with an expression that Eleanor had not expected. Not professional assessment. Awe. "Who painted these?" Miriam asked. "My husband," Eleanor said. "He was a boat restorer." Miriam looked at her for a moment. "He was not a boat restorer," Miriam said quietly. "He was a painter who restored boats to pay the bills. These are—" She stopped, walked to the large canvas opposite the door, the one of Eleanor in the rose bed, and studied it at close range. "These are extraordinary. The technique is self-taught. You can see that in places, but the observation, the quality of attention in these paintings, that is not something you can teach. That is something a person either has or doesn't have." "He was a very attentive man," Eleanor said. Miriam turned to look at her. "They're all of you," she said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "Every single one." "Yes." Miriam was quiet for a moment. "Do you want to know what they're worth?" she asked. "Financially, I mean." Eleanor looked at the walls. at the rose bed in the kitchen and the harbor front in winter and the woman asleep in the armchair with a book on her chest. "Tell me," she said. Miriam told her. Eleanor listened without interruption. When Miriam finished, Eleanor nodded once, the way you nod when something confirms what you had begun to suspect rather than surprising you entirely. "I'm not going to sell them," Eleanor said. Miriam didn't argue. She had been in this business long enough to know when a decision had already been made. "But I would like them to be seen," Eleanor continued. "Not sold. Seen. Is there a way to do that?" "There are several ways to do that," Miriam said. "Leave it with me." She left with photographs of every canvas. Eleanor locked the workshop behind her. Old habit, she caught herself doing it and almost smiled, then unlocked it again and left it on the latch. She walked back up the harbor front toward the town. She needed to find somewhere to live. She had, for the first time in a month, the means to do it properly. And for the first time in considerably longer than a month, she had something else too, a reason to look forward to what came next. 6 months later, Eleanor Marsh lived in a small stone cottage on the north side of Dunmore. Not the harborfront cottage. That one had sold in February to a young couple from Edinburgh who had walked through it twice, made an offer on the second visit, and written Philip and Caroline a check that covered their asking price without negotiation. Philip had called Eleanor to tell her, in the tone of someone reporting a personal victory. Eleanor had thanked him for letting her know and ended the call. Her new cottage was smaller. It had a garden that faced south, which meant it got the afternoon light in a way the harbor cottage never had. She had planted roses along the back wall in March, the same varieties she had grown for 30 years, bought from the same nursery in Alnwick that had supplied her since 1989. They would not flower properly until next year. She had planted them anyway. Some things are worth starting even when you won't see the result immediately. The workshop was still hers. She walked to it every morning, not out of habit. She had no habits yet in this new life. Everything was still being formed, but out of choice. She would unlock the door, which she still sometimes forgot to leave on the latch and still smiled about when she caught herself, and she would stand in the doorway for a moment before going in, the way you pause at the threshold of a place that still surprises you with its existence. The paintings were still on the walls. All of them. Miriam had arranged a small exhibition in Newcastle in April. Not a commercial show. A curated display in a gallery that specialized in what Miriam called discovered work, meaning the kind of art made by people who had no interest in being artists in the public sense, who had simply needed to make something and had made it in private for decades without ever seeking recognition. The exhibition had used 23 of Arthur's paintings. Eleanor had attended the opening on a Thursday evening in April, wearing a dark coat and the pearl earrings she had worn to the will reading, which felt like the right kind of symmetry. She had stood in the gallery and watched strangers look at her face at 29 and 37 and 45 and 60, and had felt something she had not anticipated, not self-consciousness, gratitude. A woman had stopped in front of the large canvas. The rose bed, the one that had been the first painting Eleanor had recognized herself in, and stood looking at it for a long time. Then she had turned to Eleanor, who was standing nearby, and said without knowing who she was talking to, "Whoever painted this loved the person in it very much." "Yes," Eleanor had said. "He did." The woman had smiled and moved on. Eleanor had stayed in front of the painting for another few minutes. Philip and Caroline had not attended the exhibition. They had been invited. Eleanor had made sure of that, not out of cruelty, not to make a point, but because they were Arthur's children, and the work had been their father's, and they had a right to see it regardless of everything else. Philip had replied to the invitation with a brief email saying he had a prior engagement. Caroline had not replied at all. Eleanor had noted this and moved on. There was, she had discovered, a particular freedom in having nothing left to prove to the people who had underestimated you. The proving had already happened. The evidence was on the walls of a gallery in Newcastle. Whatever Philip and Caroline chose to do with that was their own business. She had her roses to plant. On a Tuesday morning in May, Eleanor sat in the workshop with the door open to the harbor and read Arthur's letter again. She had read it most days since she found it, not because she needed to, She had it memorized now, every line, the exact way his handwriting changed slightly in the final paragraph where she suspected his hand had been unsteady, but because some things earned the right to be returned to. He had written it 3 years before he died, on a February afternoon in this room, surrounded by the paintings she now understood had been the truest record of their life together. He had written that he was sorry he had never been able to say the things that needed saying while they were face to face. That words had always felt insufficient to him, inadequate to the scale of what he felt, and that he had been afraid, this was the word he used, afraid, that if he tried to say it and got it wrong, it would reduce something he needed to remain large. So he had painted it instead. For 38 years he had painted it, every version of her that the years had made, every ordinary moment he had watched and stored and carried back to this room and put on canvas because he could not find another way to say, I see you. I have always seen you. Every version of you that has ever existed has been worth keeping. He had written that he hoped she would forgive him for the silence. He had written that the workshop and everything in it had been hers since 1987, and that he had set it up that way on purpose because he had known even then, 1 year into their marriage, that his children would never fully accept her, and that he intended to make sure she was protected long after he was gone to protect her himself. He had written, in the final paragraph, in the slightly unsteady hand, I have loved you since the Tuesday afternoon you walked past my workshop and looked back twice. I should have told you that on the Wednesday. I am telling you now. I am sorry it took me this long to find the words. I hope they are enough. Eleanor folded the letter. Outside, the harbor went about its morning. The water moved against the wall. A gannet crossed the sky in a long, clean arc and disappeared over the headland. She sat in Arthur's chair, in Arthur's workshop, surrounded by 38 years of his attention, and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for a very long time. Not happiness exactly, something older and quieter than happiness. The feeling of a person who has finally been handed the complete version of a story they had been reading in fragments for 38 years and has understood at last how all the pieces fit. She was 71 years old. She had a workshop full of paintings and a south-facing garden and roses that would not flower until next year. She had a letter she could read whenever she needed to. She had, for the first time in 38 years, a door she could leave open. It turned out that was enough. It turned out it was more than enough. It turned out it was everything. Thank you for staying with Eleanor all the way to the end. If this story reached something in you, if you have ever loved someone who struggled to say it plainly or been loved in ways you didn't fully recognize until later, or carried a loss that turned out to contain something unexpected inside it, I want to ask you one thing. Not a word, not a like. Tell me in the comments, was there ever a moment when you understood something about someone only after it was too late to tell them you understood? A moment when the full picture arrived after the person who painted it was already gone? Because I think more people carry that than ever say so. And I think there is something worth saying about it, even now, even here, even to strangers. Eleanor's story will not be the last one on this channel. Every week we bring you a story about someone who was written off too soon, dismissed too easily, underestimated by the people who should have known better, and who found, in the end, that what looked like a diminishment was actually a beginning. If that is the kind of story you want to keep hearing, subscribe. The bell icon will make sure you don't miss the next one. We will see you there.